Hey engineers, Digrock here. It's been a minute, but we have something really interesting to unpack with Space Engineers 2. Last week, we got our first glimpse into some of the ideas and inspiration of how combat will look in Space Engineers 2, including talk of incorporating shields, which is a very big topic. So let's dissect the dev diary from July 10th. It seems like a major focus of this post is on survivability, with emphasis on longer, more tactical engagements and ways to strategize and prevent one-shots. One major suggestion, which has been getting some attention, is the incorporation of shields, of which I have many notes and ideas on in this video. But also we'll break down some other ideas, which include incorporating new armor block types, better countermeasures, and most importantly, sensors and radars. This is going to be a long one, but what I am presenting is an entire cohesive system, so it really has to be one video, but I really want to know what everyone thinks about this. With SE2 in early access, now is the time to consider major changes like this, so it's crucial to the community that we stay informed and provide feedback now, so we can get this right for the lifetime of this beautiful franchise that we know and love. It's worth noting initially that I did run a poll on Reddit about if you want shields in SE2 or not, and this was just a blatant do you want shields or not with no other stipulations, of which at the time of this video is 544 people voted. 65% of the people said yes, and after reading the 100 plus comments on the dev diary plus all the comments of that post, it's clear that this is a relatively polarizing topic, so we should discuss all options available. And there's also a lot of common themes discussed in the comments, which I will also discuss in this video as well. So shields are posed as a possible solution to a problem. So before we talk about solutions, let's talk about the problem. Surprise attacks and one-shots. In his dev diary, Merrick writes, "Fights should take time, measured in minutes, not seconds. We want to avoid sudden one-shot kills and give players time to react." I think this is a super valid concept to address. In SE1, you could literally surprise the heck out of someone and completely neuter their base or ship before they even knew what was happening or that you were even there. Aside from this, many of the comments on this diary highlight how even when attacking AI, their cockpits would be destroyed instantly, which he addressed by writing, "In SE1, a single cockpit hit could end the fight instantly. We're thinking about ways to prevent this, possibly through shields or other durability layers that give players more time to react. The idea isn't to make combat slower for the sake of it, but to make it more interesting and fair." A lot of people agree with this. We'll get to shields in a minute, but I think what this idea doesn't address is why players have no time to react. So let's address a possible solution. Sensors. Currently, we have no warning systems when another player's grid is approaching. The lock-on system in SE1 only seems to pick stuff up around like 2 kilometers. I forget the exact distance. But this is only useful if you're in the pilot seat and looking for it. And even then, this isn't really enough time to prepare a response to an enemy attack, allowing an enemy to sneak right up to your grid. So right now in SE1, it feels like the advantage is with the attacker every time. And this probably shouldn't be the case. This can be fixed with detection systems such as long-range sensors and radars. As Merrick writes, "We'd like players to have ways to detect enemies, not just through visual spotting, but via tools like scanners or sensors. This also opens up infiltration gameplay where a player could sneak into an enemy base or ship and gain an advantage. But for that to work, defenders need countermeasures like surveillance systems, detection blocks, or hacking protection." Hacking is also teased, which by and large people were very supportive of that in the comments. But most of that statement seems to speak to more close-range detection when discussing infiltration, surveillance systems, and hacking. But what if there was a more powerful option like long-range sensors? I have an idea for like a 3-stage detection system. The longest would be long-range heat signature sensors that go really far out. The second tier would be more close-range radar systems. And the third would be proximity scanners. Now a concern, wouldn't long-range sensors be too powerful? I've looked at past feature requests regarding radars, and there is a common concern expressed that radars could be too powerful in Space Engineers. And to an extent, I agree. After all, if we knew where everyone was at all times, how would anyone be able to survive? It certainly could be an overpowered tool if done incorrectly. An extreme example, if anyone has ever played GTA Online, the map shows all players at all times, and one toxic player with top tier equipment can just like decimate a whole lobby. It is absolutely a horrible experience. So players' instincts are right to be concerned about a radar system. But radar systems are also a very real threat in real-life defense today. And there is a very happy and realistic solution to long-range detection which has been implemented in some servers. Heat signature sensors. One of my favorite mods in SE1 can be found in the Sigma Draconis Expanse server, which effectively simulates a heat signature sensor by giving all ships a drive signature. The mod requires all players to have an active beacon on their ship, which is on at all times, and the broadcast range is automatically adjusted in real time based on the amount of heat their ship is shedding via thrust. I looked through the mod list, but could not find this list. If you know what mod this is exactly, please let me know, and I will put it in the description along with other things I talk about here, because I'm a big fan of giving people credit that make amazing stuff in this game. Otherwise, there are some other mods in the workshop which do use heat signatures, but I'm not sure which one is the server expanse mod. In practice, the drive signature mod meant if you had a large ship with tons of thrusters all firing at one time, it would broadcast a huge heat signature via the beacon, which could be detected by other players from like many, many kilometers away. The only way to ensure you didn't broadcast such a large signature was to minimize use of large thrusters and avoid unnecessary burns, making you harder to detect, especially at longer ranges. From a detection standpoint, this balances heavy build, which likely have an arsenal of weapons and armor, versus light craft, which might be better suited for hit and run style of tactics or are just trying to just safely do mining chores and just don't want to be detected by a big monster far away. A vanilla solution to this in SE2 would be just to have sensors, which work in a similar manner. The sensors could pick up an enemy signature from deep in space based on thrust, solving the issues we have now where you don't know if a player is coming until you're within firing range. The important takeaway is this type of sensor is only detectable when you're actively using thrust. So when you fire your thrust, your range grows, and then when you finish your burn, your signature fades away. Now, of course, this does mean that a player could be vectoring towards you as they're coasting, but you can't detect them because they are coasting and not actively firing thrusters. But maybe you picked up their thrust when they first started that burn, maybe they started it out of range. But more on ghost coasting later, as I am colloquially naming it. Maybe people already call it that, I don't know. So the only balancing to figure out with this type of long-range sensor would be what is an appropriate maximum distance to detect somebody. Certainly 5 to 10 kilometers as a max range is like way too short to solve the issue of surprise attacks, especially with the new speed limits going from 100 meters per second to 300. But maybe also 1,000 kilometers is also too high of a detection range. And before I leave the idea of heat sensors, this concept pairs super well with another great mod: thrust speed bonuses. As mentioned earlier, assuming you knew the exact vector of your target, you could burn to get up to max speed and then just kind of like ghost coast to like not be detected by sensors any longer. This would be an excellent stealth strategy and a great counter to sensors. However, what if there was an incentive to continue thrust and risk being detected by others? Another great mod is Relative Top Speed by Gage, Darksaber, JP Huffman 55, and Starcore. This mod adds cruise limits to ships, which limits how fast they can coast based on mass. So heavy ships just have a lower max speed than like light ships. But what is even more interesting in the context of heat signature sensors is the boost feature of this mod. With this mod, if you apply continuous thrust, then you get a speed bonus which exceeds the base speed limit of the game. And then once you finish your burn, you start coasting again and return back to your max cruise speed. In a game which uses speed limits, what's really nice about this boost bonus and this like coasting max speed limit is I believe it's one of the most effective ways to simulate a real world scenario without speed limits, where a ship with better thrust to weight ratio could out accelerate, run down a heavier ship, or on the flip side, a small ship can evade and run away from larger ships. This whole system just introduces an entirely new navigational dynamic that doesn't exist in the game currently, where there is an arbitrary top speed for all grids no matter the size or the thrust capabilities. So vanilla pursuits right now are pretty boring because once both grids are at the same like max speed, they'll never close the gap unless the guy in the front decides to like change vectors, in which case the guy behind could like then close the gap a little bit. But like, why the hell would you do that? So right now there's just like not really any reason to like pursue somebody in SE1 unless like you're within weapons range and like you out accelerated them out of the gate or something like that. But with the incorporation into the game of a mod similar to Relative Top Speed, you can actually have pursuit scenarios. Not to mention this makes like racing far more interesting, and you could have like racing or smuggling mechanics built into the game with like NPCs, or like if you're getting chased as you're smuggling by like an NPC patrol ship, you could like maybe outrun it. You can't really do that in the base game. You sort of have to just like stick it out and fight, or just like hope that the NPC just like decides to get bored and stop chasing you. Overall, this creates a trade-off for players to decide if they want to risk detection but be able to travel faster. Now, given the huge disadvantage of giving off a heat signature, which players in proximity could detect when you're boosting, the benefit of this boost should provide like a good benefit of ship speed, allowing it to travel like 50 to like 150 meters per second above the speed limit, with the higher end of that range really only being reserved for extremely light craft with massive thrust to rate ratios, or like maybe like custom-made missiles or something like that. There could also be trade-offs for things like ion thrusters. So ion thrusters would have like a smaller heat signature because they produce less thrust than the hydrogen. But on the flip side of that, they would also get cuts to the speed bonus and acceleration. However, their main benefit is that when you are boosting, they would probably be more energy efficient because you're less likely to burn through all of your fuel like you might do with hydrogen, because you can store mass reserves of uranium for a lot easier than you can like mass tanks full of hydrogen. This also, speaking of, opens the door for more fuel efficient hydrogen thrusters, which could be more expensive in terms of components to make them, but give off a lower signature, perhaps also with a slight penalty to bonus speed, but you can burn for longer. These are really simple mechanics that I don't think make the game any more confusing for new players, which has been noted as a top priority for Keen to maintain like a low-ish learning curve, which they should absolutely maintain that because we need new players for this game all the time. But what I do think these mechanics introduce is like new interesting scenarios that also create scenarios that are more realistic to what would happen in like an actual space environment that aren't in the base game with just like max speed limits and no way to like detect anybody. So now you'd be able to run, you could hide, and with the right craft, you could also pursue. You just better hope you have big enough fuel tanks. So how would this help? Remember, all of this goes to solve the core problem we introduced and Merrick introduced of why players have no time to react in the first place. Seeing threats from a distance and who they are can allow players, especially newer players who are just starting out, to avoid conflict if they don't think they're ready for it, or more importantly, prepare for their response as that signature approaches. This alone should drastically reduce the amount of one-shot surprise attacks. Though with proper planning and the right vectoring, you can still kind of like ghost coast towards an enemy and remain undetected for a surprise attack, especially if you've previously scouted and marked with a GPS position a base, which plays into what Merrick was saying with another part of his blog post, which said, preparation should matter. Players who scout, build defenses, or prepare ambushes should be able to generate unfair local advantages. I think these mechanics play perfectly into that bullet point. More importantly, if you're going to run down and blitz somebody, even if like you've like set up an ambush and they've gotten within like 10 kilometers, whatever close they are, you still have to close that gap. So when you do decide to pounce, they will know before you're in weapons range that you're coming and at least have some amount of time to respond to it. Even something just as simple as like rotating your ship a certain direction and, maybe turning on your shields if that's a thing we're going to have. So let's consider some scenarios. I just wanted to like quickly get kind of your head working around like the trove of new scenarios and player interactions that could arise from just simple mechanics like long-range sensors and boost mechanics, which could really make a dynamic, engaging, and suspenseful and just exciting game. Let's start with a basic scenario, negotiations. Early detection could give a unique chance for the players to communicate their intentions with each other to negotiate any peace or surrender prior to firing a shot. Like maybe two ships suddenly fly within range of each other and detect the other's heat signatures. They can hop into chat to declare their intentions and potentially avoid conflict, or threaten and intimidate each other with sort of a surrender or die kind of scenario. Or maybe both just want to mine and aren't looking for a fight, so they just hang out and like just become homies and just sort of like watch each other's backs. Consequently, you might also start to recognize the signal of potentially toxic players so you can lay low if you detect them to avoid trouble. Perhaps for players with a really bad reputation, NPCs will relay data when they detect a heat signature from that troublesome player, and they alert friendly factions of the last known location of that player, and potentially even initiate a bounty and let you go chase down and like punish that toxic player. Kind of interesting, no? What about another scenario? We can't outrun them! Somebody's approaching and you're like in your ship already cruising and you can't outrun them, so you just like fire off a life pod in one direction and then just like cut the main drives of your main ship to sort of like go dark, and that life pod is on like thrust override and they see that on their heat signatures and they start chasing that, not knowing that it's a life pod, and your main ship gets off and evades successfully. By the way, a little self-promo. I have a life pod blueprint in the workshop. Feel free to slap that on to whatever ship you want. There's a build that actually has a tube that it comes in, so you just put the tube on there, delete a block, and you've got a life pod inside of a tube you can put on any ship. So have fun. Now, what about the inverse scenario? We can't catch them! Is Akbar working? I don't know if it is. Consider the opposite. You're locked into like a boost pursuit with an enemy ship, but you have like a slow frigate that can't quite keep up. Perhaps it's running low on fuel from too much boosting, or perhaps they just have a higher max boost speed than you, so mathematically you're like, we can't catch up to these guys. But your faction mate's like, don't worry, brother, I have a interceptor in the hangar, and they go and hop into their little small ship, which has like a higher speed, and they pull out of your ship, fly towards that ship to close the gap. Maybe they're able to take out a couple thrusters, which prevents them from being able to boost away from you faster, and your little slow frigate is able to close the gap, catch up. Maybe it initiates like a close range battle between your two big ships, or maybe they just surrender, or whatever. It just creates some new interesting dynamics where you're sort of benefited from having like a multiple stage system and various ships, and they can all kind of work together to like complete whatever mission you choose to embark on. Really, no matter the scenario, there are just so many new events that could arise from a combination of heat signature sensors and boost bonuses above the max speed limit, potentially even limits on the max speed itself based on weight like we talked about. There's such simple mechanics, but they're just like so rich in like gameplay and storytelling potential. Remember, this is a survival game. It's a survival game. Space Engineers is a survival game. Imagine the suspense of knowing that every second you're firing thrusters that an enemy might detect you, and you suddenly have to go on a chase or like evade, or like the thrill of being in a chase and like watching your fuel gauge drop. I'm excited about this. I hope it becomes a thing, but if not, it will be done in mods. It already is already. Like, you don't even have to imagine this. You can just go on the Sigma Draconis Expanse server that use these mods. It's super fun. That server in particular, though, there's like other limitations. Like, they're trying to make that server like the Expanse, so like you can only use forward firing thrusters, which like people absolutely hate. But aside from all of that, the detection and speed rules are super interesting things to explore nonetheless, and just make the game more rich and in some ways more realistic, because you can actually like chase people down. Like, having a fast ship now matters. Now, going back to sensors for a minute, wouldn't sensors be too powerful on planets? Yeah, long-range sensors could be a bit much on planets. To balance these long-range sensors, atmospheres could massively reduce their detection range, not only for signatures on the planet and in the atmosphere itself, but like potentially reducing the ability to detect long-range signatures in space. And terrain would like completely mask the signature, because you would need a direct line of sight to detect the heat signature of that thrust. Like, even an asteroid belt might make it hard to detect thrust, making that like a safer place to operate when you're starting out versus open space. And asteroid belts were teased in the July 17th dev diary, so that's like actually a very real consideration to this factor. And we still don't really know like how these like other factions in Space Engineers like might work. Like, if you're new and like you don't want to just get like seal clubbed by people all the time, like I imagine you could like build around like friendly faction areas that are like NPCs, and they sort of like help guard the area. And so like maybe deep space is more like really where people get into PvP and like make their own territories. I'm not really sure how it's going to work yet, but asteroid belts were teased. Also, these sensors would really only be detecting thrust. I mean, they're heat signature sensors, so they are detecting heat. So like maybe when you're up close, like really close, they could see like power generating things that are like generally warm, but thrust would really be the only thing you see from a distance. So like stations, ground vehicles, atmospheric thrusters would probably mostly go undetected by these long range thrusters. You'd really mostly be picking up like high altitude ships flying around a base, or like a rocket leaving the planet, in terms of like, you know, how are they balanced on planets. But signature sensors are also just like one tool in the detection arsenal. There could also be like medium/close range proximity radar systems, which work on planets and in space, which just detect like airborne objects surrounding your grid, but also again require a direct line of sight. Unlike sensors, which pick up heat signatures, radars would just detect actual objects around your grid and operate on a much smaller range, like maybe only like 5 kilometers, maybe 10 kilometers max. Then these would just pick up like any mobile airborne target object, whether like it's a missile, ship, or space junk. Radars could also have limits on like how small an object could be for detection. So like a small grid ship might be harder to detect from like really far away from the radar, but as it gets closer and closer and closer, that radar now finally like pings off that small grid ship. So like smaller ships would have like a radar advantage in terms of not being able to be picked up until they're like much closer to the radar. I think the line of sight requirements for both sensors and radars would keep planetary bases and vehicles hard to detect from either sensor or radar, as you can easily remain out of the line of sight of these systems and avoid detection, particularly by staying low. This also helps keep planets from being an absolute killing field, which should probably be the most important element to consider when balancing detection systems on planets. A third tool, which could be used for detection, is a scanner, which can be used to scan maybe only like 2 kilometers out, and they can scan for enemy energy signals. So this can pick up things like reactors, players, engines, batteries, atmospheric thrusters, basically anything that can consume or produce energy. And energy sources could become harder to scan the more voxels or armor there is between the scanner and the energy source. You'd also probably want ways to limit scanning, like you wouldn't want players just to like fly around and scan spam. So you'd probably have like built-in limitations, like limited field of view for scanning, require a few seconds to complete a scan, like have cooldowns to perform another scan, or maybe like scans can only be performed like when you're like somewhat stationary, like you can't scan them on the move because it takes time for it to scan the whole thing. Various disadvantages to scanning like that, just so you can't like scan and quickly find things. But I think the short range limitation of scanning, as well as like if the energy sources behind armor or voxels makes it harder to find. I think that's probably going to be balanced enough. When considering the ranges for these devices, keep in mind that our speed limit is now triple, so pouncing on other people is going to be a little bit more effective than it already is currently. So we want the ranges to be set in a way where we can like try to prevent pouncing unless the person is like doing something really stealthily to like approach and like plans a way to attack somebody. If you're just like blitzing somebody, you probably should be alerted somehow that that's happening, because we have the technology today. We should have the technology in the Almagest. Just saying. Also, a sensor like to detect scanners would also be wild. Like I picture scenes from like many sci-fi movies, like where a ship goes like dark and it's like in hiding, and then like they get scanned by an enemy ship and like it alerts the whole crew like, they just scanned us. But now we're like getting into the weeds, so like let's just move on from detection and talk about the next major and most significant idea thrown out from this dev diary. Shields and survivability. All right, this is the big one. In order to address survivability, Merrick discussed the idea of incorporating shields into the game to prevent one-shots which take out a cockpit by saying, in SC1, a single cockpit hit could end the fight instantly. We're thinking about ways to prevent this, possibly through shields or other durability layers that give players more time to react. The idea isn't to make combat slower for the sake of it, but to make it more interesting and fair. Now, shields definitely pull away from the hard sci-fi direction Merrick discussed previously of heading. The gravity generators and jump drives also aren't hard sci-fi, but those are really more there to add player comfort than anything else. And it's also unclear whether jump drives will be in SC2. I think there's a great case to not have them, but that's another video. But if there are going to be shields, there should be massive power requirements, just general drawbacks and like limitations to make them not meta over armor, with like a main consideration to not obsolete small ships. Following the rock, paper, scissors idea talked about in the blog post with offensive weapons in place with like turrets, missiles, and named weapons, so too should a balance exist in defense. Without a balance, having overpowered shields could drastically change combat in this game. A major strategy could quickly become like attack until your shields get low, retreat, recharge them, and then like strike again. And this type of combat heavily favors shields over purely armor builds, because shields could generate faster than like a player could rebuild their armor on like an unshielded grid. So this would make shields a requirement rather than an option in combat, which I think is super important to consider in this process and something that should be avoided. So I'd like to introduce possible defensive circle, not really a circle, I don't know, just maybe not so much rock, paper, scissors, but like just some other options for defense that like aren't incorporated into the game, in the vanilla game right now. So what do we have for defense? Right now we have basic armor, you have lighter, heavy armor. It's just the standard armor we get now, with the main advantage to the basic armor being that it's economical. Otherwise, the basic armor is only practical against like light, non-explosive munitions, such as bullets. And that just like begs for additional armor, such as explosive reactive armor. This would be like a new type of armor. So like it works similar to a lot of armor we have on tanks today. This armor has like a specific layer that when hit with a projectile, like an explosive layer, like in between the outer layers, like detonates and prevents the projectile from like penetrating through the armor. So this is an armor block we could have, and this variant would require more complex components, obviously, than basic armor, but like drastically increase survivability by being able to take a hit that would otherwise penetrate basic armor. This can also be effective against light munitions, but otherwise it's like mostly effective against missile strikes and like potentially slow down, if not prevent railgun shots, sort of deciding on how powerful the armor should be. But once like it gets hit enough, it loses the explosive layer inside, like it would detonate. And so like it would require replacing to like maintain that armor benefit. So like I picture explosive reactive armor as more being like panels you would add to your outside armor rather than using as like structural blocks like you would for basic armor, because of its unique property of like having an explosive layer inside of it and it becoming exhausted after that explosive layer detonates after major hits. This is just like a launch point for like new armor idea types. There like are other technological forms of armor we could explore, both that like exist today but also that like are like theorized forms of armor. So like today we have like, you know, stealth armor to avoid detection systems, like ablative armor. It's another way to prevent penetration. You could have some type of like sci-fi powered armor that like uses energy that does something. Just all of which could provide more forms of defensive benefits and like reduce one shots, but like have a higher resource cost and maybe be like exhausted after it gets hit. So like you lose the benefit after it takes so many hits. Kind of like a physical shield, if you will. And then, of course, we have shield systems, as mentioned. If we do shields, they should be sort of like a system of generators and like vulnerable external emitters that could be destroyed and require very complex components to build while having like massive energy consumption. We'll get to more on this later, but I just wanted to address shields sort of in the defensive circle. But something else that also like really isn't explored too heavily in the base vanilla game, it is in mods, but not really in the base game, is active defense systems. While this isn't necessarily armor, it is a type of block that, like I said, is completely underutilized in the vanilla Space Engineers and like plays a crucial role in survivability. A few mods incorporate these types of systems, but in game they can consist of like short range, high rate of fire turrets, like a Sea-Wiz, a close proximity flak or explosive charges similar to like the Bradley IFV's Iron Fist defense system that sort of like shoot off proximities close to the vehicle when it detects incoming ordnance, like detonate that ordnance outside away from the hull of the armor so it can't penetrate. Simple chaff, decoys, and flares like we have with planes now to interfere with missile guidance systems, like to shoot a bunch of flares away from your ship. You can have electronic warfare devices which blind or confuse AI targeting systems, especially to help counter turrets for grids that are like turret spamming. But it'd also be useful in NPC grids since like turrets taking out cockpits was a big complaint. So electronic warfare devices. You can also have small proximity EMPs, which could be powerful against shields, but they could also like knock out systems on the enemy ship. EMPs though could be like way too powerful because combat could just become whoever's able to hit the other person with an EMP first will win the combat because they just made their ship like just completely disabled and none of their shit works. That would totally be in the opposite direction of what they're looking for to increase survivability and make combat longer. So a bit of an asterisk on EMPs, maybe not the best route, but that is something you see a lot in sci-fi. And then lastly, for active defense systems, we have laser systems, like which can gradually heat up like and explode missiles like we have on naval vessels today. Just as like a side note about lasers, because I'm like writing a hard sci-fi like tabletop RPG, so I did a bunch of this research. Lasers is like a main weapon like we see in sci-fi, like ships just like blasting each other with lasers. This isn't really like a practical or like realistic weapon. You're basically taking like extremely concentrated heat and like shining it as a source. So like it really is only powerful against like lightweight small things or like volatile substances. And they're not really good over long distances because like there's no way to like contain the beam over distance. So, like it kind of spreads out and becomes like less effective. So like lasers are actually like kind of silly. Particle beams, on the other hand, could shoot like charged particles out of a barrel at like a super high velocity. Like even if you shoot like sand fast enough, it can become like crazy destructive. But you have to shoot it like really fast. But otherwise, like particle beams, they're small particles, like, but they could be useful to like intercept like rockets, artilleries, and missiles. Like you fire it really fast and you could in theory hit a target if it's like vectoring in one direction with it. Otherwise, like most like laser things you see are probably like contained plasma that you contain somehow, and when it hits a target it splatters and makes a splatter. That's more what you'd get for a laser, but like the pew 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 lasers like is kind of silly. The only option we really have right now in vanilla for like active defense systems is decoys, but like they have to be like on your grid, so like it's not as effective as like spending munitions to like launching a flare or like a flak or like a decoy away from the ship, which like can be reloaded on like just a regular turret. And turrets right now can target missiles, but like none of the vanilla turrets have like crazy high rate of fire, so like they can become pretty oversaturated pretty quick with incoming ordnances unless you just have like a spam build ship, which is like kind of lame. I feel like there is still a lot to explore with defense systems before going into shields. Just looking at today's technology, it's impressive the systems currently in use, and I feel like these should be considered in the Almagest. Otherwise, it seems like we're like arbitrarily limiting our sci-fi combat and our tools to like Cold War era weapons platforms, which like doesn't really make sense in like a futuristic sci-fi game. But shields are a big topic, and a lot of people love the idea, and I too think they can be viable. So I have some ideas for how shield systems could work and be implemented in a balanced way. Balanced shield systems. I think the first thing to consider with shields is how will they work? Like just from a scientific standpoint, like do they emit particles around the ship, like held in place, like suspended by a magnetic field to like intercept ordnance? Are they simply just electromagnetic fields which like redirect like metallic munitions or whatever? Are they swarms of exploding nanobots which like detonate on projectiles? Having some type of like loose science in place can drive how the system should work in game, especially as it pertains to power consumption and like how the shield is emitted. The server I played on most, that I enjoyed the most, was the Stone Industries gaming server. Shout out, great server, one of the top ones on the server list. It's awesome. They used what I believe is a defense shields mod. I looked through their list and I couldn't find the shield mod, but I looked on the workshop and this looks like the mod. So it's defense shields by Ash Like Snow and BDC Carrillo. This mod made it more comfortable to go like roaching against NPCs and not have to repair your ship after taking like one salvo or after like long combats. So you could like just kind of keep fighting and keep going and going and going and like stay alive for a long time. But this mod was far from a perfect solution, as evidenced by what I just said about you could survive for a very long time. One gripe I had was all it took to have a shield was the same 4 components built inside your grid, no matter the size of the grid. And the power of the shield was based on how much power your grid could produce, and more strangely, the shape of your ship. So if you were like min-maxing your shields, the way to get the highest HP of your shield was to have your ship shaped like a cube, along with having the maximum allowed energy producing components on your grid, and optimizing your weapons to like not use that energy, but using your energy just for your shields. But aside from that, the thing I dislike the most about the shield system and most shield mods is all shield components can be placed inside of your ships, which means when it emits a shield, it technically like emits from like that shield source inside your ship through all of your armor and ship components and like your crew members to like outside your ship, which like doesn't make any sense at all. Like, nor does that even seem safe for a crew. Like, you would all just like probably die. Furthermore, it also means that the ship's shield system couldn't be fully disabled without near total destruction of the ship itself. To fully disable the shield system of a ship with internal shield components, you have to first break through the shield, then penetrate the armor protecting the shield components while hoping the shield doesn't recharge during that time, which it does many times, and then finally destroy the components themselves. So like in practice, shields pretty much remain active and can recharge until the ship's hull was like near or completely destroyed. Which brings me to the first thing I'd like to see in a potential shield system: external emitters. So if we go the route of shields, what I'd personally like to see, and I think this resolves a lot of the complaints I've been reading in the comments, are shields being emitted from a shield emitter block located on the outside hull of the ship. And each emitter block would have limits on like the max power and the size that could be produced from that emitter, meaning larger ships would need more external emitters to get full coverage, kind of like a mesh network. And that emitter block shield, the shield that emits, would be no stronger than the same emitter on a small ship. What I love about the system is like once you knock down a shield from like just an individual emitter, you could then target and destroy that emitter block directly to prevent the shields from coming back online in that area. More interestingly, an emitter that gets destroyed on one area of a ship does not prevent all the other emitters from producing protection, allowing small ships to create vulnerabilities on large ships with many emitters. We can also use these emitters to achieve balance. So if shield HP is solely reliant on grid power, like it is on like many mods, then large ships with tons of power will become indestructible monoliths that small ships never have a chance of penetrating, creating massive imbalances, which does exist on these servers that use these mods. Therefore, I would suggest that each emitter block has a maximum fixed power, regardless of the size of the energy output of the ship it's installed on. So unlike the defense shield mods, where your shield HP is directly tied to your overall power output of the ship, this limitation of max power per emitter would make shields proportionally more effective on smaller ships, since a single emitter block offers the same level of defense, whether it's on a small grid or a large grid. To take it a step further, we could also have emitter blocks have settings in the control panel to adjust the radius of the shield provided by the emitter. The same energy could go into the emitter regardless of the radius, granting a smaller radius greater protection because the same energy is used by the emitter of a big radius, but it's all that matter is located in a smaller space, creating a denser shield. I'm going to use this flashlight as an example. So here I have an adjustable flashlight with a beam. It's the same power input, but what we can do is adjust the level of beam and how the radius of the beam is. So you can see when the beam is really tight, it's super bright. This would be your dense shield, great for small ships. But if you need wider protection, that same power output can be used to provide a wider shield, but this shield is much thinner. You can see the light is much dimmer, thus resulting in a thinner, more vulnerable shield, but perhaps more suitable to protect large ships. So if you have a small ship with a low profile, especially in the front of the ship, you can adjust the emitter to get the maximum protection and that little nice dense shield for that small ship, whereas the large ship might use the larger radius to get more protection and not need as many emitters since there is massive power requirements. A thin shield could still block some ordnance from like an initial wave of an attack, but it couldn't get the pounding that a smaller, denser shield could. This can also be paired with a power slider. This would be sort of the brightness of our flashlight, which lets you dial in how much power is given to the emitter. Again, there's still only a maximum power that can be provided by any emitter, but this gives the option to turn down that power from an emitter in case your grid doesn't have enough juice to give full power to an emitter, or if you were just running a smaller ship and you just didn't need like a super powerful shield sucking through your uranium and you're trying to make a more economical ship. So while larger ships can compensate with more emitters, their individual emitters can still be taken down just as easily as those same emitters on a smaller ship, especially if they're used in a wide area creating a thinner shield. This most crucially, big emphasis here, most crucially ensures that small ships can carry the firepower to still be able to take down the shields of a larger ship and create that vulnerability to get inside and do more damage. Because if they can't, small ships would be absolutely useless in SE2, as they are in pretty much every server I've played that uses shields, and everyone would need some type of large armored Borg cube with a huge power plant inside of it. Combining the emitters idea with our detection and cruise speed limits, the benefit now of the larger ship isn't that it's a power plant with like mega shields, but rather its advantage is that it has more armor and more weapons, with the trade-off that it will be slower than smaller ships and have a larger heat signature, potentially with a slightly thinner shield if it couldn't provide full power to all emitters, which would require massive power. We'll get up to that in just a second. On the flip side, small ships can remain nimble, have a higher max speed, and provided they have the power, which they probably would be able to with just a single emitter, have denser shields but less armor. That, in my opinion, would be a balanced shield system. There could in theory also be different sizes of emitter blocks that provide like greater protection, but these would likely require just like exponentially even more power to operate, as you absolutely have to avoid the scenario where small ships can never take down the shields of large ships. I'm going to double down here. Large ships have tons of armor and massive arsenals. They don't also need invulnerable shields. Their advantage on smaller ships is their armor and their weapons. They don't need a third advantage. I truly believe these external emitter blocks would introduce a strong balance to what otherwise could be a very potentially overpowered mechanic. Since they could be destroyed, they would serve honorably as a first wave of defense to allow you time to react without getting obliterated, but not dictate the flow of the entire battle. I, as well as many people, have mixed feelings about shields, but acknowledge they certainly would solve some survivability issues. But please, for the love of God, Keen, require them to use some type of external emitter that is vulnerable, and not solely components that could be tucked deep inside the hull of a concrete brick ship. There has to be a balance here and a way to reasonably disable shields. It really can't be overstated. Which brings me to the next major balance needed from shields. Shield power consumption. Shields should require a butt ton of energy. Not an impossible amount, just enough to be luxuriously expensive. I think ideally you wouldn't want people passively flying around with shields on all the time, but rather have them activated as a form of temporary or early defense when needed. You should have to commit massive energy resources to keeping a shield online. For instance, maintaining a heated ionized plasma in suspense through an electromagnetic field, which is a theorized concept of a shield, would at all times require massive power, not just the initial charging. We sort of see this in some Star Wars and other space video games where you have to decide like how many ticks of energy you want to commit to like shields versus thrusters or weapons. Implementing a high fuel cost would ensure that shields remain a luxury, helping to prevent larger ships with massive shields from completely dominating literally everything else. If every emitter block has a maximum power output and radius of protection, which consumes a set amount of energy, then to provide protection across a large ship would require more emitters and consume massive resources, simply making it far less economical to always have your shields online. This potentially could even just lead to many large ship players skipping shields and saving the resources to rely on well-engineered armored ships. Plus, going back to Merrick's idea of infiltration, if you can sneak up on an enemy before they become aware of you and activate their shields, you might be able to gain access to and sabotage or hack an otherwise impenetrable fortress while their shields are down. This could also be more emphasized by having a time delay between when you activate shields and when they come online, and systems with more emitters might take more time to activate the shields as shield matter has to move through and be projected out of the system. Speaking of shield matter, again, this goes back to like how are these shields working in the first place, but perhaps the shield matter could come from internal generators and is conveyed to the emitters and has limits on like how much matter it can create and move, thus limiting the recharge of the emitters, especially if you have more, which is like would be a limitation for more large grid ships than anything else. Shield matter could also be stored in reserve tanks, which like doesn't require power to generate, but you run through it like a fuel as your shields take damage and it's being replenished, which might be a beneficial system for small grids with less power. This area gets more nuanced because the more components you have taking power to make the shields function, the more advantage skews towards the larger ships, which can support these systems. So this is an area that like definitely requires some more nuance and decision making and an important consideration when deciding the science of these shields. So all of this isn't to say you could, in theory, always have shields online, particularly for large ships, but you'd have to spend a fair amount of time mining and processing like uranium to keep reactors pumping to support such an action, not to mention whatever fuel is required for like the matter of the shield itself. So like longer active shield times might be more sustainable for smaller grids with smaller shields and like less emitters, but it might not necessarily be sustainable for large ships with tons of emitters. At the very least, you'd need like an entire faction behind you, just like mining to support your war efforts to keep your shields up for longer, which encourages more team building and camaraderie to like achieve such a feat. So I guess like if that's how you like would want to commit your time to the game, then like go for it. But at least it would take an army to like support running such a large and expensive like shield power system, which would probably outweigh the benefits you're going to gain from like whatever mission you're on, creating like an economic balance to shields in addition to any combat balances. Another benefit of high power cost shields is it would also prevent battles from being too drawn out. Similar to what we talked about with speed boost consuming excess fuel reserves, so too would using shields draw excess fuel from the ship's power reserve, especially as the shields are taking damage, potentially draining the ship of fuel such as uranium or shield matter, which would help prevent ships with strong shields from being locked in a stalemate and force the battle to resolve either through attrition or retreat. Plus, all you have to do with this system is take down the shield of one emitter block in one area and destroy that, and that might create the only vulnerability you need to penetrate this ship. If at the end of the day, shields become too powerful, big shielded ships will rule the Almagest, and small ships will be nothing but fiery sacrifices to Clang. End of story. That is the consideration with shields. So just some additional shield considerations as we wrap up here. So just to get into the weeds for a second, in case we aren't already there, by the way, if you're this far in, like just subscribe already. This is clearly the channel for you. If shields are incorporated, what are their limitations? For instance, like how do collisions work between two grids when their shields like cross over, or if like a shield collides with voxels? Do the emitters in that region where they cross over just like temporarily come offline until the area is clear? If so, is a simple counter to a shield just like launching a small shielded drone or just an object into an enemy ship shield to disrupt the emitter in that area, knock it offline, and create a temporary hole? Otherwise, this honestly could be a benefit of like regionalized emitter blocks that only emit to like a certain region. Because if the field is disrupted, then your shield only goes down for that emitter area rather than going down for the entire ship. Plus, this would also like work better for vehicles anyway, so you could put shields on like all sides of the vehicle, but like not where the ground's at, because that would just be like you can't like shield the ground. Like, do shields work in water? Because that's a thing now. Like, do weapons even work underwater, or are we just gonna have like torpedoes? Are there grid limits for how many emitters can be placed, or just limits to shields in generals for a grid? Can people pass through a shield? Can enemy ships fly through your shield? And can you fly through your own shield? If one but not the other, why is the mechanic or science in place that allows one type of grid to pass through but not another? Do missiles pass through shields? Or like, if a friendly grid or missile passes through your shield, is like the emitter in that location like temporarily turned off to like allow the object to pass through, or like maybe that emitter field just like gets disrupted, leaving you like temporarily exposed, like thus making shields like totally a defensive tool? And speaking of missiles, like, can you put shields on missiles or like drones or satellites or like literally any other like tiny grid? Because like shielded nukes would like be straight up wild. But again, they should be easy to like down the shield of the nuke, but just another consideration. Basically, what are all the ways this system could be extorted, and can these be resolved in a manner that feels balanced and sensical? Shields are a big choice, and maybe we're ready for them. Certainly the polls say that most people do want them. And I think a lot of the reasons that people vote no on these polls is addressing a lot of these issues I have talked about with like shield HP and like ships that just have way too much power. If we can balance it, I think a lot of the no's will convert to yeses based on the comments I've read on my Reddit poll. I think what I've outlined is like pretty reasonable, and honestly, this kind of a system gets me excited for shields, but maybe more countermeasures and detection systems could be explored before going this route. But if you absolutely hate the idea of shields, just know that if implemented, people could still make custom servers disabling these blocks. It's as simple as that. So at least if they're in the game, players who want them can have them, and the majority of players do say they want them. But if shields aren't in the game and you want them, we do have mods. So maybe somebody who wants to like mod can use this video as a reference point of like, hey, this is maybe a good shield system to incorporate. So whether they're in the game or not, I'm sure we'll have them, and there will be ways to also play without them as well. So it's not the end of the world one way or the other. One final note about one-shots. So I think one thing I will just say with the new unified grid system, we're now able to put more armor like around cockpits in like cool ways, like while still maintaining a certain degree of visibility, which will allow us to build more protected cockpits. Not to mention, we can also design better cockpits on our own, like without relying on the pre-made cockpits, which in some way are more vulnerable to be destroyed because they are a single block. So with that, we might already see one-shots becoming less common, especially if we incorporate detection systems mentioned earlier, or new types of armor such as reactive armor, or just like disruption systems that like mess with the targeting of like turrets. Another major complaint I saw in the comments on the issue of shields is shields also don't solve another core element of survivability, which is turret spam. Many players complained of unreasonable ship builds, which like are loaded to the gills with turrets. An often proposed solution to these type of builds is some type of heat buildup mechanic requiring exposed radiators to cool off, which if damaged start to cause components to overheat. I don't really want to get into heat dissipation in this video, even though it would be a great feature to include, because it's a huge topic with many elements to discuss. Otherwise, some type of countermeasure to disrupt turrets can massively help with turret spam, and that would also lead to one of the most reliable forms of combat being manually aimed weapons, which also require the most skill. So I think a step in that direction would also like be beneficial. And these countermeasures could also help reduce cockpit one-shots, as many people in the comments have claimed that it's turrets that are pretty much causing these like quick one-shot cockpit deaths. Whew. So those are my thoughts. I know this was a long one, but these are all cohesive, and I wanted to put this perspective out there before any permanent decisions have been made in the games. Shields are a huge and polarizing decision, and if made, I just hope they're done in a balanced way, which makes them an option, not a requirement, and doesn't obsolete small grid ships. So share your thoughts below. Consider joining my Discord, which is actually a rapidly growing community of Space Engineers 2 players that I'm building in preparation for multiplayer shenanigans. I'm so excited for the future of this game. Keen, keep up the amazing work. Merrick, thanks so much for being like a transparent developer with like having these brainstorming dev diaries where you kind of like spitball these ideas out here that like lead to these type of videos and like community involvement. I think that's so valuable in this day and age. And I can't wait to see you all in the Almagest. Godspeed, engineers.